I'm CK. The other day, one of my subscribers suggested that I make a video on tools one would need to build Eurorack modules. That's a great idea. I've never done that. You can see the tools I use in the videos of building Eurorack modules, but let's just have a video focused on this. This is aimed primarily at Eurorack. However, the same thing would be true if you're building a radio, if you're building a clock, if you're building whatever. So I'm going to go over the bare minimum of tools I recommend, and then also add some extras that you might want to buy or acquire to fill out your tool set. This is not the only list one could have. If you have other tools you like better, if you have other things that fit your work style better, that is absolutely brilliant. Do what works for you. I'm just offering this as a guidepost to say, here's what I use. If it works for you, grab these. If not, maybe it'll give you some ideas about some other stuff. This list is based on building hundreds of kits, repairing many, many electronics projects, working on automobiles and airplanes over the last 40 years. So I'm pretty confident in what I'm talking about here. So take a look. Hopefully you'll get something out of it, and I hope you enjoy the video. We'll start with hand tools. And here is the basic set you need. You need some side cutters. Could be big, could be small, could be whatever. You need some needle nose pliers for adjusting stuff, for tweaking stuff. You need a flathead screwdriver, generally a very narrow one. As you can see, this tip is very narrow. That will allow you to be able to calibrate trimmer pots, trimmer potentiometers on the back of a module. You need a Phillips head screwdriver of some type, generally small. That's for assembling boards together if they've got standoffs, or for mounting it in your rack. And you need something to get desolder stuff. This is a manual solder pump. You can also use, if you don't want to get one of these, you can use the copper braid that comes in a little disc thing. I've never been able to figure out how to use that, so I don't talk about it because I can't use it. The other thing is you'll need some type of sharp blade. I have a couple of X-Acto knives, blades that are just lying around on my workbench if I need to cut something or trim some wire or trim a little piece of plastic off a kit. So that's the basic set. You don't need anything more than this. In fact, this is not necessarily necessary if you're extremely careful with your soldering. So that's not much to get started. Now, one thing, if we want to go further than that, there are a couple other things I will recommend. Instead, or as well as the side cutters, you could also get some flush cutters. These allow you to, where's the circuit board? These allow you to trim a solder point right flat against the board. I don't care much about that, but I use these to trim leads off all my components. One thing that I strongly recommend, even though it's not required, but I strongly recommend, is tweezers. And I've got two types here. This is your standard tweezer, and this is locking tweezers that you open them up, put something in them, and they stay. The locking tweezers are very handy for holding a IC socket onto the board while you start soldering it, for holding wire in place, for doing whatever. If you can get some of these, you will appreciate it later on. As for the tweezers, this is from a set of 12 tweezers from Amazon. They cost like 30 bucks. So I do recommend those strongly. And another nice to have that I use, and I use this for both Eurorack, and I use it a lot for guitar amp building or repair. This is one of my pokey things, and it's got a green stripe on it of electrical tape that I put on there because this is plastic and non-conductive. So I can be safe if I'm poking it deep into the guts of a 400 amp, a 400 volt guitar amp. Always check if you have something you want to poke into a circuit, get your meter out, check for continuity, put some voltage across it and see if it does conduct, because it would be bad if it doesn't, and mark it. Anything I have on my bench that does not have a green stripe on it means that it is conductive and not necessarily healthy for me to use. That's the basics for hand tools. Next, we'll move on to soldering. Of course, you're going to need a soldering iron to affix components onto your project. This is an area where I do recommend you spend as much as you can, as much as you're comfortable with, to get a good product, because you will be using this. This is the bulk of what you'll be using to assemble Eurorack or any other electrical component. I have right here a Weller and a Haco. Those are the two high-end hobbyist type units that are most popular. They're both good units. I use Weller because 38 years ago, Weller customer service treated me very well when I had a problem with one of their irons, and so that type of customer service created brand loyalty for me forever. Now, you don't need this. You can get a simple pencil type with a good tip and it will work fine for you. These have a little more flexibility in temperature setting and rapid coming up to heating and all that, which is great, but you don't need one of these more expensive units. You can get one of these for under $50, I think. I haven't bought one of these in a long time. So that's soldering options. Get a good soldering iron. Along the way, as you go through this, you will also want to decide what soldering tips you like. Here are my ready soldering tips that I have in my little solder stand, soldering iron stand. I use primarily, let me zoom in on this a little bit and jerk the camera around. I primarily use a tip with a 30-degree bend in it, and it's a very small tip. It's 0.03 inches. I also have a small chisel tip. I have a bigger chisel tip. I usually use this inside guitar amps. A very long, pointy chisel tip. Actually, I have two of those. But you don't need all these. You need one tip, and what I would strongly recommend is don't listen to people on the internet who say, oh, never use this kind of tip, only use this kind of tip. There's one gentleman in particular who goes on about that. I won't mention his name, but he goes on about that, saying, this tip should never be used. That's just dumb. Use the one that feels good to you. Spend 20 bucks to get an assortment of tips for the soldering iron you use, like I've got this from Amazon, and choose the one that works for you, because you're the one who's going to have to do it. And if a long conical tip works for you, do that. But I do recommend you try the others just so you have context for what works. Next, when you're soldering, you need to have a place to solder. Hold on a second while I swap out props. Now this next category is almost a nice to have because you don't really need it, but I want to talk about it anyway because most of you will want to have something like this, and this is something to do your soldering on. Now, you don't necessarily need this. I know of people who just take a notebook, lay it down, and put their circuit board on it to stabilize it. So I'm going to go from that, from what you see up. So here is one of the typical PCB holders you can get online and many people recommend. And it's, I was about to say it's fine. It's not. I just like these. They frustrate me all the time. I get irritated with them. Positioning the board, if there are components near the edge, can be a pain. These thumb screws instead of lever locks are a bad idea, and other things. I could rage on about these for a while, and I've got three different kinds of these from 3 different manufacturers, and I dislike them all. That's me. You may find them very, very useful because you can put components in, flip it over, and do your soldering, and that's can be very useful. So get one of these. This one is, I think this is from stumac.com, but these are branded under many, many different names, and they all basically do the same thing. Now, one thing you may want to consider, particularly if you're focused mainly on Eurorack, is getting a pan of ice and using that as your solder holder, because it can do pretty much the same things. I can, if I loosen the tension a little bit, I can flip that back and forth and do my soldering that way. The benefit of using something like a pan of ice to do this is, besides being a solder stand, it's also a vise, and you can use it for many other things. So that is certainly value in there. It's got some of the same limitations as the other PCB holder I showed you, and on this one, I think, if I can see, if this one, yeah, here. I don't know whether you can see this, but unfortunately, Pan of Ice makes these out of plastic, and you can see on here, I've melted the plastic a bunch of times by touching it with my soldering iron. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And finally, if you are going to use something, this is what I use, which is just a soldering pad. This is high temperature silicon rubber. It resists heat up to about 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can touch your soldering iron to it when it's hot and not cause any damage at all. I use it because it's slightly resistive, so things don't slide very much. And I made this, and on the back, I put in the mold, when I poured this mold, I put little things in there, so you can drop a component in there to hold it still or whatever. I have a video on this. I'll try and put links to all the stuff I'm talking about. And this was very easy to make. Now, one reason why I use this, and I'm going to promote this one a little bit because I do think it's got value. One reason why I use this, first off, when you're soldering, these others have a lot, you can press hard. But when you're actually soldering, if you're pushing hard on the circuit board, you're doing something wrong. You shouldn't have to. You're just lightly resting your iron and flowing solder onto it. So you're not gorillaing it. The other thing I like very much about this is I can position any way I want. I don't have to fight the angle. I don't have to fight how it's presented to me. I can move it around any way that I want to get to it. So when I do this chip socket, I can do bop, 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 get all those legs and just flip it around and do the same thing. So this, for me, is the best solution. You may find that one of the other ones works much better for you, and that's great. Just think about it when you're working on it. And while we're on the subject of soldering, I want to talk about the solder that I recommend for Eurorack in particular. This is 0.031 solder. That's 0.8 millimeters. I find this to be the most effective general purpose solder. You can even use it for surface mount, though I don't recommend that. I recommend you go smaller for that, but I'm not going to talk about that in this section. So get yourself some good 0.031 diameter solder. The other options that would probably help out your workbench, and I forgot to grab this, so I'll grab it over here and come walking back while I'm yakking. I also recommend you go a little smaller. For surface mount, this is 0.025 solder from MG Chemical. Now you can go even smaller. I've got some 0.015, but I rarely use this because I don't find I need it. This is thin enough for surface mount. And then bigger. This is 0.062, 1.2 millimeter. This solder is really good for amplifiers and point-to-point soldering, where you're soldering wires across an old-style circuit board, or if you're working on a speaker or something like that, get a little bit thicker solder. So that's what we're talking about with soldering. Next is organization. When you're working, you want to have your parts organized. You don't want them spread across your workbench, subject to getting knocked on the floor or whatever. When I'm working primarily, I use parts trays. Now, these are not official parts trays. If you go on Amazon and look up parts trays, what you're going to find is something like this or this with a magnet. All the parts trays I can find on Amazon are magnetized. I dislike magnetized parts trays. I think they're, for a lot of reasons. So if you want to do a magnetized parts tray, go get a magnetized parts tray if that suits your needs best. But I don't like magnetized. I like regular stainless steel with no magnets. So how did I get these? Well, this, a deep bowl one, which you see in most of my videos, this is actually a pet food bowl from Basis Pet, stainless steel. And I wrote workshop on it, so I don't feed the cats with this one. So look around. This parts tray was not called a parts tray. It was called a tattoo accessory tray or a dental accessory tray. Again, no magnet. Now if you don't want to get one of those, or if you need to put your parts away because your workspace is dual purpose with a dining table, for example, you may want to pick up one or two of these plastic parts containers, which are dandy. They have lots of slots. You can pull out the dividers in many of them, so you have a bigger slot for larger components. These can be very handy, and again, if you have to break down your table because it's being used for something else, putting your parts in there and then taking that away is really very handy. Now I'm going to go a little bit further on organization because I know how much this helps me, and some of you may be handy people in your garage or shop, and you can do something like this. This, when you see me in my videos, often you'll see me reaching that way. That's because I'm reaching for this. This is my workbench tool caddy. Bendy pliers, side cutter pliers, needle nose, flush cutters, flat nose, longer needle nose, one standard screwdriver, one Phillips head screwdriver, bunch of tweezers of different types, and a couple of clamps clamped onto the back. And as you can see on the back side, I've got 2 rolls of solder. I've got the 2 rolls I just talked about, the medium size and the 020, whatever I said, I forget, 031, the 64 and the 031, or 31, I'm sorry, I'll say it right in a second. And I built this. It's pretty straightforward to build if you have a little wood acumen. little piece of pipe in the middle here that I can slide out when I want to change my solder when I run out of a reel. This is really, really handy. It's the same for me as with your soldering organization, getting one of these. The reason why, and I'm going to go to the other camera and pull back a little bit, I think. I'm going to come up a little bit. So when I'm working, I'm looking at the work underway, and if I need, what is going on? If I need a tool or I need my soldering iron, I'm focused down. I'm looking down at this, and I just reach over and grab my iron because it's always here. I don't have to look up. It's always there. Same with the tools. If I'm working on something and say, ooh, I need to screw that down, I can just reach over and I knew where it was. I don't have to move my head. Again, this is a very, very much a nice to have, but if you can, if you're handy with woodworking or metalworking, however you want to do it, pretty easy to build. I actually wrote up some drawings about that design, but I don't know. If you think I should post them somewhere, just let me know in a comment and I will. That's the organizational step, minimum you need. Next we'll talk about some test tools. Next, in test tools, one thing you absolutely must have to do Eurorack is a meter. Could be a very expensive one, like this Fluke that I use. I use Fluke because I've been using Fluke forever. I'm sorry, it's just kind of built into me. If I want a meter, I get a Fluke. This one from Amazon was like $100, I think, and it's got graphical stuff. It's good. It's a good meter. Rechargeable, so you don't ever have to worry about batteries. This ProTech was less than $50 on Amazon. And if you don't want to do any of that, this Elenco is a kit. This kit costs, I think, 30, maybe $40. And you put it together yourself, and it's a very competent meter. I'll post a link to this in the description if I remember, which I probably won't, just so you know. So that's the bare minimum. You must have a meter, primarily because some modules are going to require you to calibrate them to a specific voltage. So grab yourself a meter. Now some other handy tools that are in the inexpensive side of things. First, this is a little audio generator. You know, you can get a big desktop audio generator with lots of configuration and a wide bandwidth, infinite frequency selector. But this, again, I'll put it in the description if I can still find it. This I got, it was like $25, and I've got it on times 10, times 100, so there's 2,000 hertz. What is that? That's 6,400 hertz, 180, it goes all the way up. You can go up to 20,000 hertz limit, basically, of human hearing. And this is really handy, and it's very inexpensive. It takes one 9-volt battery, and you can toss it around. The only thing you ever have to worry about is it doesn't automatically go off. You have to turn it to the off position, and if you forget, you'll reach for it and the battery will be dead. The other tool that you'll see many people use, and I just turned the light down a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about, is an oscilloscope. And I have an oscilloscope. If you're going to do this long term, or if you have other projects you want to do, you'll probably want to get a scope. In grand scheme of things, for a decent one, you're going to spend $200 to $500, which can be more than you want to budget for that, and that is completely understandable. And it's not required. However, if you want to try something else, here is a little oscilloscope from a kit. This costs less than $50 US. And it's a pretty decent little scope. You can see the trace there now for the frequency output of this audio generator. And as I change the switch, you'll see it's reacting and giving you a nice waveform. It's got holds, it's got different value settings to allow you to configure the scope. It's very, very useful. And again, inexpensive. It's a kit. You put it together. It's not a hard kit to put together. And I actually have this hanging up above my head in case I need to quickly test something and don't want to drag the full scope over. So if you want an oscilloscope but can't afford it, which I certainly understand, get one of these for 30 to 50 bucks, put it together, and you'll have a very competent scope for doing things like Eurorack. Two other things I'd like to mention. You need a good light. You need a strong light in a color temperature that's comfortable for your eyes. You need to be able to see what you're doing. And I have this one that's on a little gooseneck, flexible gooseneck, so I can bring it around to where I need it. That's my choice. There are many, many lights out there. Pick the one that works for you. This one combines two things. It's a ring light that I can get real close to stuff, and it also has a magnifier in the middle of it, which is useful because that's the other thing I wanted to mention. As you can see on my head, I have my magnifying visor. It's good not just for the soldering aspect of things, but if you're looking at chips, particularly surface mount chips, you really need to get in close to see what the part number on them is. And when you're soldering surface mount, you really need to get in there. So you can get one of these, or you can get one of these flexi stand lights. I use these. I actually use this flexi stand light when I'm building guitar amps, because sometimes my hands are all in the way, my head's in the way, and this can't get in there, and I can angle that in so I can see deep into a guitar chassis to solder something. That's the overview. These are the tools I find essential, plus some nice to haves if you can afford them. Obviously, you can get tons more tools. I've got, hold on a second. Never mind, I was going to get a shot of my 4 toolboxes and all the cabinets with test equipment and other specialized tools, but you don't need that. That's not the focus of this video. So we've looked at the basics, and this is for Eurorack or any electronic building. And get those and you would be pretty comfortable with what you're doing. And if you have some additional tools that you want to see additional information about, let me know in the comments. I'm going to do another video about testing Eurorack and putting it up on a test rack and what things you might need to do there. And whatever else you may want to ask about. I'd be happy to fill you in on what I do. It's not authoritative as you must do this. Nothing in this hobby or avocation is like that. This is what I use, and it's based on 40 years plus of experience and works for me. I hope you enjoyed the video.